Orel Hershiser stepped into baseball history as one of the most disciplined and mentally tough pitchers the Los Angeles Dodgers ever had, and his peak came together in the 1988 season, one of the greatest seasons ever recorded in MLB. That year, he won the National League Cy Young Award, cementing himself as the league's best pitcher, while also setting a record with 59 consecutive innings, without allowing a run, a feat still talked about as the standard for control and endurance. He didn't stop at the regular season. He led the Dodgers through the brutal pressure of the playoffs, earning NLCS MVP honors before stepping into the World Series and becoming the heart of the historic victory over the Oakland Athletics, where he was named World Series MVP. Over his career, Hershiser made multiple All-Star teams, won a Gold Glove for his outstanding fielding as a pitcher, and finished with more than 200 career wins, a milestone not many pitchers reach. With a style built on control, strategy, and calmness, he wasn't the fastest or the hardest thrower, but he was the one who made hitters feel most helpless, and that turned him into an enduring icon for the Dodgers and for American baseball. But behind those perfect numbers and history-carved honors was a completely different story, a story of prolonged endurance that few people ever really saw. Every pitch in the 1988 season wasn't just a step toward glory. It was also a step closer to the limits of his body, as his shoulder and arm gradually wore down through game after game with no real chance to rest. The nights after games weren't moments of celebration. They were long hours facing nagging pain and the fear that tomorrow he might not have enough left to keep going. When the serious shoulder injury hit in 1990, it wasn't just a physical issue. It was the collapse of the sense of control he built his whole life around, the terror that his best version was gone forever. And even after coming back from surgery, no longer the Hershiser of 1988, he kept playing, kept fighting in silence, not to prove anything to the world, but to prove to himself that he hadn't broken, that even when the glory had faded, his will was still intact. If the story behind Orel Hershiser's spotlight makes you think, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters, where we dive deeper into the pains the world never saw. After everything the world saw under the lights in 1988, very few people ever wondered where that journey really started. Because the truth is, Orel Hershiser didn't grow up as some destined child of sports, wasn't a name people marveled at from childhood, wasn't a prodigy every coach chased. He was just an ordinary kid in Ohio, ordinary to the point of near invisibility among peers who were faster, stronger, and more standout. In those early practices, he wasn't the hardest thrower, not the one with perfect mechanics, and definitely not the one who made others stop and notice. If anything set him apart, it was that he always had to try harder than everyone else just to keep up, while other kids seemed to progress naturally as if talent was pre-programmed in their bodies. Orel had to repeat every motion, every pitch, every drill with near-desperate persistence, not to become the best, but just to not fall too far behind. And it was in those years that a quiet feeling began to form. Not loud, not clear, but persistent. Like a tiny crack in the mind, the feeling that he wasn't enough. At school, on the field, anywhere there was comparison, Orel was usually the one trailing, the name not mentioned first, the choice that was never number one. No one told him he'd one day be a legend. No one looked at him and saw a bright future ahead, and maybe that carved a deep doubt into him that he carried for years after a silent question repeating, "Am I really good enough?" Praise, if it came, was rare and never enough to erase the sense that he always had to prove something, always had to run faster, throw more, practice longer, just to be seen, just to exist in a world that didn't seem built for someone like him. And gradually that effort stopped being a choice and became instinct, a way of life, a survival mechanism. But the most painful part wasn't that he wasn't the best. It was that he started believing that was an unchangeable truth. As those around him moved ahead easily, Orel learned to stay quiet, learned to accept being behind, learned not to expect too much to avoid disappointment. And in that acceptance, part of him shrank back. He stopped dreaming big like the other kids, stopped believing he could become something special because all the evidence around him seemed to say otherwise. But right there, the paradox began to form. The more he felt he wasn't enough, the harder he worked, the more he was overlooked, the more persistent he became, and the less he was recognized. The more quietly he built a will he himself didn't yet realize he had. There were afternoons he stayed on the field longer than anyone, when the sun had gone down and no one was watching, throwing ball after ball into the empty air as if trying to convince himself he deserved to be there, that all this effort wasn't pointless. No applause, no crowd, no one keeping score, just a boy and a quiet obsession that if he stopped, if he gave up, he'd disappear completely. And it was in those unwitnessed moments that something began to take shape, not innate talent, but a stubborn will, a near painful endurance, a determination that didn't come from confidence, but from the fear of being left behind. Many years later, when the world saw Orel Hershiser as an icon of composure and control, few knew that inside that man there always lived a boy who'd once felt he wasn't enough, who'd stood behind everyone else, who'd had to try twice as hard just to be noticed, and maybe that feeling, the feeling that never fully went away, became the biggest driving force in his life, but also the deepest wound he carried. A wound that didn't bleed, wasn't visible, but quietly shaped every decision, every effort, and every moment he stepped onto the mound, as if he were still trying to prove what no one had ever promised him from the start, that he was enough, that he deserved it, that he wasn't just a shadow behind others, but a person who could stand in the center even if it cost him everything. And when he stepped into his college years at Bowling Green State University, Orel Hershiser didn't walk onto the field as a rising star, but just another name on a long list of players trying to find a spot for themselves, someone without aura, without expectations, and without making anyone pause to wonder if he could become anything special. While his teammates got attention for speed, power, or natural talent, Orel stayed quietly in the back, continuing the only thing he knew, working more, enduring more, being more patient. But even after doing all that, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he was just trying to catch up in a race others had been leading for a long time. At this level, where every player had once been the best where they came from, the differences became clearer than ever, and Orel realized he wasn't the one who could dominate games with raw talent. He couldn't step on the mound and make hitters afraid with one pitch, couldn't rely on what nature gave him, because he didn't have much of that to begin with. And it was in that harsh truth that a change began, not in mechanics, but in how he saw himself and the game. If he couldn't shine, then at least he had to survive. If he couldn't be the best, then he had to be the one who didn't make mistakes. College games weren't where he proved himself a star. They were where he learned to avoid failure, learned to control every tiny detail, every pitch, every decision, every moment where a mistake could get him replaced instantly. In his head, there was no voice pushing him to become a legend, no bright dream guiding him, just a whisper repeating like a survival instinct. Don't fail, just don't fail. And that whisper, seemingly weak, became the foundation for everything he built later, because it forced him to perfect every smallest detail, to become precise, disciplined, and cold in his approach to games. Not to impress, but to not get cut. He began to understand that in a system where the most talented were always prioritized, the only way to survive was to become so reliable you couldn't be ignored. The guy coaches could trust with the ball in the toughest spots, not because he was better than everyone, but because he made fewer mistakes than anyone. But what was the cost of that way of living? It was gradually losing the ability to dream big, losing the sense that he could become something far beyond the present. Because when you live to not fail, you also unwittingly give up the right to win spectacularly. And Orel, even if he didn't realize it right then, had started building his entire career on a foundation full of contradictions. A foundation of fear turned into discipline, of lack of confidence turned into control, of obsession with not being good enough transformed into perfection in every detail. When the day came to get drafted into MLB, he wasn't a name the system was proud of. Not a top choice carrying huge expectations, but a modest pick, a player no one was sure could go far, and that only reinforced the belief he'd carried from the beginning, that he always had to prove, always had to fight to keep his spot, always had to live ready to be replaced at any moment. And so, when many look back at Orel Hershiser's career and see a calm, precise pitcher who never panicked, they don't realize all those qualities weren't born from confidence, but from a very deep fear, the fear that if he let up even once, if he made one mistake, everything he'd built would vanish, that his place in this world wasn't guaranteed, but something to defend every day, every game, every pitch. And it was in those college years, with no stadium lights, no fame, no recognition, that Orel learned the most important lesson of his life. Not how to become the best, but how not to get eliminated. Not how to shine, but how to survive. A lesson that seems small, but would follow him through his entire career, quietly shaping every decision, every win, and even the tragedies he'd later face. And then, when the door to professional baseball finally opened, it didn't lead Orel Hershiser to the light. It led him into a long darkness. The years in the minor leagues, where there were no packed stands, no cheers, no sign he was getting closer to the dream. Just endless bus rides, quiet little fields, and a life so repetitive it made a person start wondering if all this effort meant anything. There, each day wasn't measured by wins or titles, but by how long you could hold on before being replaced by someone younger, healthier, or just luckier. And for Orel, that feeling wasn't fleeting. It was constant, a quiet pressure weighing on every step, every practice, every time he stepped on the mound with no one really watching. His life in those years had no stability, no sense of being on the right path, just a chain of constant moves from city to city, makeshift hotel rooms, rushed meals, and long evenings facing himself in silence. No cameras, no reporters, no one recording those moments, and that made them heavier. Because when no one sees you, you start wondering if you really exist in this world. Games happened in front of sparse crowds, where the sound of ball hitting glove rang louder than any cheers. And each time he came off the field, no one was waiting to praise or criticize, just prolonged silence, as if everything that just happened didn't matter. In moments like that, the question Orel had tried to avoid came back, clearer, heavier. Should I keep going? Will all these years of effort lead anywhere? Or is it just a long road ending in being forgotten? He wasn't the only one carrying that question, but for him it had special weight, because he had no innate talent to fall back on, no shining moments enough to guarantee the system would patiently wait for him to develop. Every day passing was another day. He had to prove he deserved to stay, not with spectacular performances, but with not making mistakes, with stability so near invisible it paradoxically made him easier to forget. And that was the greatest tragedy of those years. Not clear failure, but the feeling of living as if you didn't exist. No big collapse marked it, no dramatic event to name, just the slow grinding down of hope, bit by bit, through season after season, without breakthrough, through time after time being passed over when chances went to others. Orel kept pitching, kept practicing, kept showing up every day as if everything was fine. But inside, part of him started getting tired. Not physically tired, but tired of believing in a future with no evidence it would come. There were nights he lay in bed in a strange room, listening to the thick silence around him, wondering if this was all he'd ever have a career. No one remembered. A journey leaving no trace, a life passing without anyone really noticing. And in those moments, The thought of quitting stopped being distant and became a real option, an escape from the endless loop of effort without reward. But what kept him going wasn't firm belief in success, but something harder to name: a quiet stubbornness, a determination not based on hope, but on not knowing what else to do but keep going. So he stayed. Not because he was sure he'd succeed, but because he wasn't ready to accept that everything he'd done up to then was meaningless. He kept stepping on the mound in small fields, kept throwing pitches no one remembered, kept living a life that seemed to matter to no one. And it was in that unrewarded persistence that something began to be forged. Not fame, not glory, but an endurance few could understand. But even as he kept going, even as he didn't quit, the question stayed there, quiet, persistent, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Would any of this lead to anything, or would he forever just be an invisible name in a system that never stopped to look back? And then, after all those years of existing in silence to the point of near invisibility, a door finally opened, but not like a promise, more like another test, harsher, colder, when Orel Hershiser got called up to the Los Angeles Dodgers roster, stepping into Major League Baseball not as someone awaited, but as a temporary name, a choice that could be replaced at any moment if he didn't prove his worth right away. For many, reaching MLB was the destination, the reward for years of effort, but for Orel, it felt like starting a whole new competition, one where every game was a test, every pitch carried the risk of being judged, eliminated, sent back to the place he'd spent years trying to escape. There was no sense of safety, no moment where he could relax and say, "I've made it." Instead, everything got more tense, because at this level, a mistake wasn't just a mistake. It was proof you weren't good enough, the reason someone else would take your spot, and Orel understood that better than anyone, because he'd never been seen as an obvious choice from the start. Every time he stepped on the mound, he didn't think about dominating hitters, didn't think about becoming a hero. He thought about one thing only: don't fail. Don't give them a reason to cut you. And that very thought turned every game into a prolonged psychological battle, where the pressure didn't come from the crowd or the opponents, but from the fear inside, the fear that one bad day could end it all. There were games he pitched well, even great, but even when he left the field with a solid performance, he didn't feel relief. There was no sense of victory, no full joy, because in his head, one question kept repeating, "Is this enough yet?" And the answer was almost always no. Because in an environment where only the very best got to stay, good enough was never really enough, and Orel, who'd grown up feeling he wasn't enough, could even less believe he'd done something worthwhile after just a few games. Success, if it came, was temporary. Stability, if it came, was fragile. And his spot on the roster always felt like it was hanging in the balance, waiting for one mistake to drop. That pressure didn't vanish after a week, a month, or even a season. It became part of life, a familiar rhythm he had to live with every day. He got to the ballpark earlier, stayed later, did everything possible to control what he could control, because he knew any factor outside his grip could be the thing that cost him everything. But the harder he tried to control, the more fragile he felt. Because deep down, he still didn't believe he truly belonged here. He didn't see himself as a real MLB player, but as someone being given a chance, temporarily a chance, that could be taken back any time. And that very instability seeped into how he played, how he thought, how he existed. He didn't play to shine, didn't play to be remembered. He played to survive one more day, one more game, one more chance. Every pitch wasn't a step toward glory. It was an effort to hold on to his fragile position in a system that never paused to wait for anyone. And the most painful part was that even as he started proving himself, even as the numbers slowly improved, even as he stopped being an easy name to overlook, that insecurity never went away. It didn't depend on reality. It had become part of who he was. So while outsiders began seeing a steady, reliable pitcher who could be handed the ball in big situations. Inside Orel was still the boy who'd stood behind everyone else, still the person who always felt he was only here temporarily, still the one who believed one mistake would make it all collapse. And maybe that's what made him different. Not that he wasn't afraid, but that he never stopped being afraid. And instead of letting that fear destroy him, he carried it, turned it into drive, into discipline, into a way of existing. No one saw, but that decided everything. But what was the price of living like that? It was never truly feeling you'd arrived, never fully enjoying what you'd achieved, never having a peaceful moment where you could say, "I'm safe." And for Orel Hershiser, those first years in MLB weren't the start of greatness. They were the extension of an old war he'd begun long before, when he was a boy always feeling he wasn't enough. And now, even on the biggest stage, he was still fighting the same fear. Only this time the whole world was watching, but no one really saw. And then, slowly but irreversibly, Orel Hershiser began shifting his place in the Los Angeles Dodgers not through explosive moments that made the whole stadium stand, but through something fewer people noticed yet far more valuable in the eyes of those who understood the game: consistency. He wasn't the pitcher who terrified hitters at first glance, wasn't the one with the fastest or fiercest stuff, but he was the one coaches could trust, the one the team could lean on in tough times, the one who wouldn't let you down. And, paradoxically, that very thing became the heaviest burden he had to carry. At first, that trust felt like a reward, a sign he'd finally found his footing after all the years of being overlooked. But very quickly, it turned into an obligation, a standard he had to maintain every day, every game, every pitch. No more room for mistakes. No space to experiment, no right to be weak. Because when you're the reliable one, you're no longer playing just for yourself. You're playing for other people's belief, and that belief doesn't allow failure. Every time he stepped on the mound, he didn't just carry the ball. He carried the expectations of an entire system, a team, and the people who'd placed faith in him. A pressure not loud, but suffocating enough to strangle any error before it could happen. And so Orel began changing how he existed in games. He no longer played with the freedom of someone still searching for himself, but with the control of someone terrified of losing what he'd built. Every pitch was calculated, every decision weighed, every moment had to stay within the safe boundaries he'd set for himself. He became more precise, more disciplined, more dependable, but at the same time, he slowly lost a part of himself, the part that dared to risk, dared to fail, dared to be imperfect. Because in his world now, perfection wasn't a goal anymore. It was the bare minimum requirement. No one said outright that he wasn't allowed to fail, but everything around him quietly communicated it. A bad game wasn't just a bad game, it was a crack in the image he'd built, a sign that made others start doubting, a reminder that his spot still wasn't as secure as he wanted to believe. And for someone who'd spent his whole life proving he deserved to stay, that doubt wasn't just pressure, it was obsession. So he did the only thing he knew. He tightened his grip even more, controlled even more, allowed no element to slip outside his control. But that very control began taking something from him. When you're always required to be steady, you're no longer permitted to be human, with good days and bad days, strong moments and weak moments. You become a system, a machine programmed to operate within a set range, and any deviation is seen as a flaw. Orel, who'd once been the boy trying to be seen, had now become someone not allowed to change, a painful paradox, because to survive, he had to give up his own human flexibility. There were days his body was tired, times his arm didn't feel like before, moments he knew he wasn't at his best, but he couldn't say it, couldn't show it, because the image he'd built didn't allow it. People didn't expect him to be explosively great, but they expected him never to collapse, and that expectation, though it seemed gentler, was cruel in its own way, because to always be steady, you have to hide every sign of weakness, have to keep going even when inside, you're slowly burning out. And gradually, the consistency he'd once seen as his greatest strength began turning into an invisible cage. It kept him in the position he'd fought to reach, but at the same time locked him in a role he couldn't escape. He couldn't get worse, but he also couldn't allow himself to change, couldn't try to become something else, because any change carried risk, and risk was something he'd learned to avoid long ago. So he kept going, kept throwing precise pitches, kept everything in control, kept being the one everyone could count on. But inside, a question began forming, quiet but impossible to ignore. If all I do is avoid mistakes, am I living or just surviving? And in that question lay a truth he wasn't ready to face, that the consistency he'd built wasn't just the path to success. It was also the chain binding him, turning him from a person searching for his place into a machine not allowed to stop, not allowed to weaken, and most importantly, not allowed to be himself. And then, after all those years of being forgotten, those days of existing in fear and discipline to the point of nearly imprisoning himself, 1988 arrived, not as a gentle reward, but as a storm sweeping Orel Hershiser into the center of baseball history, where everything he'd quietly built suddenly exploded into blinding light the whole world couldn't ignore. That season, he didn't just play well, he dominated. In a cold, precise, almost surreal way, every pitch like perfectly programmed, every game like a math problem solved with absolute accuracy. And the streak of 59 consecutive scoreless innings wasn't just a record, it was a declaration that the man once seen as not enough had now become the standard for control. The Cy Young Award came as undeniable recognition, and for the first time in his life, he was no longer the name standing behind, he was the center. But what the world saw was only the result, not the cost. Because to achieve that perfection, Orel had to push himself far beyond what a human body can naturally endure. He didn't just compete, he endured. Every game wasn't just a win, it was one more time. His body got stretched a little further. His shoulder bore a little more load. His arm took a little more wear. No one saw. When he stepped on the mound, there was no sign of pain, no hint of fatigue, only a calm face, steady breathing, a perfect machine in the eyes of the fans. But inside, the first signals of overload had started appearing. Small, easy to overlook, but far from harmless. And then the postseason came, where everything was pushed to the extreme in the NLCS and then the World Series. He wasn't just part of the team. He was the pillar, the one carrying the biggest moments, the one the whole team leaned on when things got fragile. The World Series MVP wasn't a surprise. It was the inevitable outcome of a journey where he'd pushed himself to the absolute limit. To the world, it was a perfect story, a miraculous season, a hero emerging from nowhere, an ending Hollywood could hardly write better. But for Orel, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a price he'd pay for years to come. Because the body doesn't forget. It doesn't care about titles, doesn't care about applause, doesn't care that you've become a legend in others' eyes. It only records every pitch, every load, every time you forced it to keep going when it had started to tire. And in the 1988 season, Orel forced his body to do that over and over, until the line between capability and overload began to blur. The initial pains were fleeting, then clearer, then became part of life he learned to ignore, because at that moment he had no choice, not when the whole world was watching, not when the team depended on him, not when he'd built his image as someone who never broke. And that was the most painful paradox of greatness. To achieve it, you have to ignore the warning signs. Keep going even when you know you're going too far. Sacrifice things you only later understand can't be reclaimed. 1988 turned Orel Hershiser into a legend. But at the same time, it began a quiet process and irreversible erosion, an accumulation of damage that wasn't yet big enough to stop him then, but deep enough to change everything afterward. When the season ended, when the lights went out and the cheers faded, the world looked at him and saw an absolute winner, an icon of perfection, a season any player would dream of. But in the silence after it all, there was a truth no one really saw. His body had started paying the price, and it didn't stop when the season ended. It had only just begun. And maybe, if there was one question no one back then was close enough to ask him, it would be this: a question he himself wasn't ready to face. What if the greatest season of your life was the very moment you began losing yourself? And then, after the 1988 season came to a close, while the whole world was still enchanted by the miraculous story Orel Hershiser had just written, a cold reality began to emerge. Not on the stat sheets, not in the headlines, but in his own body and mind. He was no longer the man of 1988, but the cruel part was that no one would accept that truth. To the fans, to the media, and even to the Los Angeles Dodgers themselves, Orel Hershiser wasn't a person who was changing. He was a standard, a perfect version forever framed, a memory they believed could be repeated if he just tried hard enough. The pressure didn't come as open criticism. It came as silent, never-ending expectations. Every time he stepped on the mound, no one said it out loud, but everyone thought it. This is the guy who threw 59 scoreless innings. This is the Cy Young winner. This is the World Series MVP. And those very titles, those achievements that had once been the greatest pride of his life, now became the yardstick he was forced to measure himself against. Every day, every game, every pitch. It was no longer enough to pitch well, no longer enough to be steady, no longer enough to help the team win. He had to recreate the unrecreatable, a near-perfect season, a version of himself that even his body could no longer reach. And Orel knew it. He felt it in every movement, every pitch, every day when his arm didn't respond like before, every moment his body needed more time to recover. But the schedule wouldn't allow it. The pains he'd once been able to ignore now became clearer, more persistent. Like a reminder that there are limits even willpower can't overcome forever. But he couldn't tell anyone, couldn't admit he was declining, because in the eyes of the world, he still had to be the man of 1988, still had to be the icon of control, of endurance, of a kind of perfection they'd grown accustomed to seeing. And it was in that silence that a new fear began to form, a fear unlike anything he'd ever faced before. Previously, he'd feared being overlooked, feared not being good enough, feared having no chance. But now, his greatest fear wasn't not being chosen. It was not being able to become his past self again. He was no longer fighting to be seen. He was fighting not to be compared to a version of himself he knew he could never return to. There were games where he still performed well, still controlled the game, still did what a reliable pitcher needed to do. But inside, he knew something had changed. The pitches weren't as sharp as before, the confidence wasn't as absolute, and most importantly, the sense of control, the foundation of everything, began to waver. And when you're a pitcher who lives by control, losing that feeling isn't just a technical issue. It's an identity crisis. Gradually, the game he'd once loved, the one that had given him a chance, that had taken him from obscurity to the top, began turning into the source of pressure and anxiety. Every time he stepped onto the field, it was no longer an opportunity to shine, but a challenge not to fail against his own memory. He began to fear what might happen if he couldn't meet the standard the world had set. Feared the disappointed looks, feared the inevitable comparisons, feared that one day people would realize what he'd felt for a long time, that he was no longer the man of 1988. And the most painful part was that he couldn't escape it. He couldn't go back to being an anonymous player, couldn't return to the days when good enough was enough. He'd become an icon, and icons aren't allowed to change, aren't allowed to decline, aren't allowed to be human. So he kept going, kept pitching, kept fighting, kept upholding the image the world expected, even as inside he grew further and further from the version they were trying to hold on to. And perhaps that was the deepest tragedy of success not failing, but being trapped in your own greatest moment, forced to live in the shadow of a perfect version you know you can't return to. For Orel Hershiser, 1988 wasn't just the peak, it was an inescapable standard, a memory he had to face every day, and a quiet fear that no matter how hard he tried, he would never again be enough to be himself. One more time. And then what Orel Hershiser had quietly felt for so long finally happened, not as a sudden collapse the whole world could see, but as a limit crossed too many times until the body could no longer pretend everything was fine. In 1990, after consecutive seasons carrying not just his own pressure, but that of an entire team, and the memory of 1988, his shoulder finally spoke up, no longer the nagging pains he could ignore, but a clear signal that something had been pushed too far, and this time it couldn't be overlooked. At first, like all the times before, he tried to keep going, because that's what he'd always done. He'd grown used to not listening to his body, used to putting others' expectations above what he felt, used to believing that if he just pushed a little more, everything would be okay. But this time, there was no a little more. Every pitch grew heavier, every movement less natural, and the scariest thing started happening. He lost what had defined his entire career: control. For a pitcher like Orel, control wasn't just a skill. It was his identity. He wasn't the fastest, wasn't the strongest, but he was the most precise, the one who could place the ball exactly where he wanted, exactly when he needed to. But as the injury dug deeper, he realized his body no longer responded the way it once did. Pitches started missing their spots. Adjustments no longer worked, and for the first time in years, he stepped on the mound unsure if he could do what he'd once taken for granted. That wasn't just a technical change, it was a psychological shock. Because when you've built your whole life around one thing, and that thing starts slipping away, you don't just lose ability, you lose yourself. And Orel, who'd spent his career controlling everything, now faced a truth he couldn't control. His body was betraying him. When the official diagnosis came, when surgery became the unavoidable option, reality finally became clear. This was no longer something he could overcome with willpower. This wasn't a game he could win with discipline or persistence. This was a physical limit, a boundary that, whether he wanted to or not, he'd reached. And in that moment, everything he'd ever believed in began to shake. Surgery wasn't just a medical procedure, it was an interruption, a pause he'd never been ready to face. While the world kept moving, while the team kept playing, while the season went on, he was forced to stand on the sidelines, watching everything from a distance he'd never experienced before. No mound, no games, no familiar rhythm of life, just silence, and a question he couldn't avoid: if I can't come back like before, then who am I? Recovery wasn't a clear journey with a certain endpoint. It was full of doubts, tiny progress mixed with setbacks, moments of hope followed by disappointment. And the hardest part wasn't the physical pain, it was accepting that maybe his best version was already gone. For someone who'd always lived by proving himself, that thought wasn't just scary, it was nearly impossible to accept. There were days he wondered if it was all over, if the career he'd built through years of effort could vanish just because of one injury. And scarier still, he began to realize the answer wasn't entirely in his hands. Before, he'd always believed that if he worked hard enough, controlled well enough, made no mistakes, he could hold his spot. But now, no amount of effort could guarantee he'd return to his old self. That was the moment his body broke down before his mind could accept it. Because, while his body had stopped, his mind still wanted to keep going. still wanted to believe everything could return to the way it was, that with more time, more effort, he'd be the man of 1988 again. But deep down, part of him started to understand that might never happen. And it was in that conflict between what he wanted to believe and what his body was telling him that the real tragedy began. Not the injury, not the surgery, but facing a truth he'd avoided his whole life, that there are things you can't control, limits you can't overcome with willpower alone. And sometimes it's not because you're not good enough, but because your body no longer allows you to continue. And in the silence after it all, with no cheers, no lights, no titles to hide the reality, all that remained was one man and a question he'd never prepared to answer. If it really is over, then everything he sacrificed to reach that peak, in the end, what did it mean? And then, after all those long months of silent recovery, Orel Hershiser finally returned to the mound, not amid explosive cheers of a reborn hero, but in a quieter, more cautious atmosphere, where every eye followed him with the same unspoken question. Is he still the same as before? His return, on the surface, was a victory, a testament to will, to discipline, to overcoming adversity. But deep inside, it was the start of a new war, more subtle, more painful, because this time the opponent wasn't the injury. It was memory. Right from those first games back, Orel felt what he'd feared. His body still worked, still let him compete, but not the way it once did. Pitches could still be accurate, but not as sharp. Situations could still be managed, but not absolutely. And most importantly, the confidence that had once been the foundation of everything. The feeling he could master the game was no longer complete. And in a sport where the difference between success and failure can be just a few inches, that small change became enormous. But what made everything harder wasn't the decline itself. It was how it was perceived. Every time he stepped on the field, he wasn't just facing the opponent in front of him. He was facing his own 1988 self. No one demanded he return to perfection, but everyone remembered him that way. And that memory, though unspoken, became the invisible standard he was forced to measure himself against. A good game was no longer seen as a success, but as a question. Does it compare to 1988? A small mistake was no longer normal. It was proof he'd lost something. And Orel knew it better than anyone. He didn't need the press, the fans, the analyst. He felt the difference in every pitch, every movement, every moment. He had to try harder to achieve what once came naturally. And that awareness made everything heavier, because he couldn't lie to himself. He was no longer the man of 1988, and the most painful part was that he was still expected to live as if he were. There were games where he pitched well, even excellently, by any other pitcher's standards. But when he left the field, he felt no relief, no full joy, no complete sense of victory, because in his head there was always another version standing there. A more perfect, stronger, mistake-free version. And anything he did in the present, no matter how good, could never outshine that shadow. And that was the trap he was caught in. Not the decline, but having to live in constant comparison to his own past. Every game became a reminder not of what he could do, but of what he'd lost. Every pitch a comparison, every mistake evidence, every moment short of perfection. Confirmation that he was no longer the man the world had once celebrated. But what no one truly understood was that the pain wasn't in no longer being perfect. It was in having to keep competing while knowing it, because to many, his return was a beautiful story, proof of resilience. But for Orel, it was a far more complicated reality in existence between two worlds, where he was no longer his past self, but couldn't escape it. He couldn't go back to being an unknown player, couldn't return to days when good enough was enough. He'd become an icon, and icons aren't allowed to change. So he kept going, kept stepping on the mound, kept pitching, kept fighting, not to reclaim what was lost, but to prove he could still exist, could still contribute, could still not be finished. But inside, There was a truth he couldn't share with anyone, a pain no one truly understood, that every day he competed wasn't just an effort to move forward, it was a constant confrontation with a past he couldn't surpass. And perhaps that was the most profound tragedy, not losing the peak, but having to live under its shadow, because when your greatest moment becomes a standard you can no longer reach, you don't just lose perfection, you lose the feeling that you're enough. And for Orel Hershiser, a man who'd spent his life fighting that very feeling, returning wasn't the end of a tragedy. It was its continuation, in a subtler, quieter, but no less painful form. And then, while the world continued to view Orel Hershiser through the lens of numbers, games, and results flashing on the scoreboard, another battle was raging one. With no audience, no commentators, no one recording it, a silent war where the opponent wasn't the opposing team, but his own body and mind. After returning from injury, Orel had no choice but to keep going. But the way he kept going had completely changed. He could no longer rely on what had once made his name, could no longer impose his will on games the way he had in 1988. Instead, he had to relearn how to exist all over again. Every pitch now wasn't just a tactical decision. It was a careful calculation between what he wanted to do and what his body would allow. There were days his arm felt heavier than usual. Days his shoulder responded slower. Days when even a tiny deviation could trigger a chain of consequences he couldn't control. But he couldn't stop, couldn't pull back, couldn't say he needed more time, because the game doesn't wait for anyone, and his place in it wasn't guaranteed. So he adjusted. He changed his delivery, changed his approach, changed how he read games, not to get better, but to adapt to what was left. And that was one of the hardest things for any athlete to accept, that you're no longer your best version, and that you'll never get back there. Orel, who'd once controlled games with near absolute precision, now had to learn to live with imperfection, to accept that some pitches would miss their spots, some games wouldn't go according to plan, and some days he simply couldn't do better. But acceptance didn't mean surrender. It was a painful process where every step forward came with a piece of loss. There were games where he stepped on the mound with a body not fully ready, but he was still there, still pitching, still fighting, not to prove anything to the world, but to keep a promise to himself that he wouldn't quit. No more dominating performances, no more perfect scoreless streaks, no more moments that made entire stadiums hold their breath. Instead, there was quiet persistence, completing each game, each inning, each pitch, even when it wasn't perfect. And to outsiders, that might have looked like decline. But to Orel, it was a victory of a different kind of victory, not measured by titles, but by the ability to keep going when everything had become harder than ever. But what no one really saw was the mental toll of that battle. Because when you're constantly adjusting, constantly compensating for what's been lost, you never get a moment to fully relax. Your mind is always working, always calculating, always on guard, as if one small mistake could make everything collapse. And that tension didn't vanish when the game ended. It followed him home, followed him into sleep, followed him into every thought, every unseen, silent moment. There were nights he lay there, not from physical pain, but because his mind couldn't stop analyzing every pitch, every decision, every moment he could have done better, every mistake he couldn't erase. And in those moments, the war became clearer than ever, not between him and opponents, but between him and his own limits. Part of him wanted to believe he could still come back, that all this was temporary. But a deeper, more realistic part knew some things had changed forever. And it was in that conflict that he kept going. Not because he felt no pain, not because he didn't recognize what he'd lost, but because he didn't know how to live without fighting. Because if he stopped, if he accepted he could no longer continue, then everything he'd built, everything he'd endured, everything he'd sacrificed would become meaningless. So he stayed in the fight, even when no one saw, even when no one understood. And perhaps that's what makes Orel Hershiser's story different, not that he reached the peak, but that he kept going after falling from it. Not that he never failed, but that he learned to live with failure without letting it define him. But what was the price? Carrying a war no one else could see. A war with no clear end. A war where victory wasn't returning to the past, but simply not collapsing. And in the silence of that war, Orel Hershiser kept walking, not as a celebrated hero, but as a man fighting day by day, moment by moment, to hold on to himself. And then, after all those unseen battles, after the years Orel Hershiser tried to cling to every piece of himself in a body no longer the same, the moment he'd quietly avoided finally arrived. Not with a grand announcement, not with a tearful farewell game, but with a simple, cold truth. He could no longer continue as before. His career ended not because of one single decision, but because of a series of signs he could no longer ignore, his body no longer responding, his pace no longer keeping up, and most importantly, the fight had gone on too long. But what no one prepared him for wasn't stopping. It was what came after. Because when an athlete leaves the field, the world doesn't pause to wait for them. Baseball goes on. Seasons keep happening. New pitchers emerge. New records get set. New stories get told. The Los Angeles Dodgers keep playing, with new heroes, new moments that make crowds stand and cheer. But this time, without Orel there. And the most painful part wasn't that he was no longer playing. It was realizing his absence changed nothing. Throughout his playing years, he'd lived in a world where everything revolved around the rhythm of games, where every day had a clear goal, where every pitch carried meaning, where every moment was defined by who he was on the field. But when it all stopped, the void that appeared wasn't just time, it was identity. He was no longer a pitcher. No longer the man stepping on the mound, no longer the one the team relied on in big moments. And the question he dodged in those earlier years now returned, stronger than ever. If there's no more baseball, then who am I? No more cheers, no more lights, no more evenings with tens of thousands watching his every move. Instead, there was silence, a different silence from the minor league years, because this time there was no clear path ahead. Before, silence came with hope that one day he'd reach where he wanted. But now there was no one day, no goal to chase, no fight to wage. And that very absence made everything heavier than ever. There were mornings he woke up with no specific reason to prepare, no game to think about, no schedule to follow. And in those moments, he began to realize most of his life had been shaped by baseball, not just his career, but how he saw himself, how he understood his worth. And when that vanished, he didn't just lose a job, he lost a part of himself. People around him might see a retired legend, someone who'd achieved everything an athlete could dream of, but inside it didn't feel like fulfillment. It felt like being left behind, because when you've lived in a world where everything had clear meaning, moving to a life without specific definition can be scarier than any injury. No more opponents to face, but also no more victories to claim. And that's the tragedy few talk about. Not that the career ends, but that the world doesn't change when you leave. It keeps going, without waiting, without looking back, without stopping to ask how you feel. And in that flow, you have to find a way to exist again. Not as an athlete, but as a person no longer defined by what you did on the field. For Orel Hershiser, a man who'd spent his life fighting, proving, surviving in a system that was never easy, stopping wasn't the end of the war. It was a different kind of fight, where the opponent was no longer injury or pressure, but the void, the silence, the question without a clear answer. And in that silence, he had to relearn how to live, not as a hero, not as an icon, but as an ordinary person, in a world that had moved on without him. And then, In the emptiness baseball left behind, Orel Hershiser began stepping into a life he'd never really had time to understand before family life, where there were no scoreboards, no crowds, no pressure from tens of thousands of eyes, but also no clear definitions of win or loss. On the surface, it was a gentle, even ideal transition from professional athlete to husband, father, a person living in the stability he'd rarely had before. No more constant travel, no more late nights at the stadium, no more frantic pace of the season. Everything slowed down, got quieter, more predictable. But in that very quietness, another truth slowly emerged, that quiet doesn't mean peace. No drama, no scandal, no loud upheavals to cover the inner void. His life from the outside could be seen as stable, even enviable. But for someone who'd spent his whole life living under pressure, goals, constant battles, that stability sometimes felt alien. No more games to prepare for, no more challenges to overcome, no more moments where everything depended on one pitch. And in that absence, he began to realize part of him still didn't know how to exist without the fight. Family became the new center of his life, a role he cherished, but also had to learn to adapt to. As a father, a husband, he was no longer defined by stats or titles, but by presence, care, and the small things he'd possibly missed before. But even in those moments, there were times he felt like he was standing between two worlds, one of the present, quiet and stable, and one of the past, where everything had clearer meaning, where every day had a purpose, where he knew exactly who he was. There were quiet afternoons when nothing special happened, when everything followed the normal rhythm of life. And it was in those moments that the emptiness became clearest, not sharp pain, not obvious loss, but a hard-to-name feeling of absence without specific words to describe it. He was no longer pressured to prove himself, but at the same time, he no longer had the chance to do so. And for someone who'd lived his whole life proving himself, that shift wasn't always easy. Yet in that very silence, another process began, slow, quiet, but profound. Orel started finding meaning in new roles, not by completely replacing the past, but by learning to live alongside it. He was no longer the pitcher on the mound, but he still carried everything he'd learned. Discipline, persistence, endurance. Those qualities didn't vanish when his career ended. They just changed how they were applied. He began taking on new roles in the baseball world, not as a competitor, but as a sharer, a guide, someone on the sidelines but still connected to the game that had shaped his life. But this time, there was no pressure to be perfect, no expectation to control everything, no fear that one mistake would make it all collapse. And it was in that difference that he gradually found another kind of peace. Not the absence of pressure, but the acceptance that he no longer needed to live under it. But that didn't mean everything became easy, because the past doesn't disappear. The memories, the standards, the questions, they're all still there, just no longer triggered by every game. There were times he looked back and wondered what would have happened if things had been different, if his body hadn't betrayed him, if he could have extended the peak a little longer. But then there were moments he realized some questions don't need answers, that some things don't need to change for life to keep going. And perhaps that was the hardest lesson he had to learn, that a person's worth isn't only in what they achieve under the stadium lights, but also in how they live when the lights go out. That silence isn't always the enemy, but it's not always the friend either. That peace isn't a natural state that appears when everything stops. It's something that has to be built, bit by bit, through small choices every day. For Orel Hershiser, life after baseball wasn't a perfectly closed chapter. It was another journey, a journey without audiences, without titles, without explosive moments, but no less important. And in that silence, he kept searching, not for a way to become the man he once was, but for a way to accept the man he'd become. And then, as time kept moving forward, as the years away from the field gradually accumulated into decades, Orel Hershiser stepped into another phase of life, one with no more pressure to compete, no more battles to win, but with one opponent he couldn't avoid, his own body. In his 60s and beyond, everything that had once been ignored, endured, or pushed aside during his peak years began coming back. Not loudly, not suddenly, but persistently and impossible to ignore. The pain was no longer something that only appeared after a grueling game. It became part of every morning, every step, every smallest movement, as if his body were quietly retelling a story he'd tried to forget. His shoulder, the place that once carried thousands of pitches, that bore pressure few could understand, was no longer as flexible as before. Movements that used to be simple now became slower, heavier, sometimes accompanied by a lingering dull ache. There were no more pitches, no more games, but the traces of all of it remained, like a reminder that the body never forgets what it has been through. There were days he woke up and felt more clearly than ever that he no longer owned the body that had once taken him to the top of truth, with no way to change, only a way to accept. The difficulty wasn't just in the aches, but in the meaning behind them. Every pain wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a memory, a reminder of seasons past, of pitches thrown, of moments when he'd chosen to keep going even knowing his body was nearing its limit. Back in those years, he had no time to think about long-term consequences. No one on the mound thinks about how they'll feel at 60. All that mattered then was the current game, the next inning, the next pitch. And so he did what every athlete at their peak does, he kept going, no matter what. But time, like the body, doesn't forget. And when there were no more cheers to drown out the pain, no more adrenaline to mask the fatigue, everything that had been pushed back started surfacing more clearly. There were movements he had to think twice about before making, simple activities he could no longer do naturally. And in those moments, the truth became undeniable. Greatness always has a price, and that price isn't always paid right away. Perhaps the hardest thing to accept wasn't that the body changes, because everyone knows that happens with time, but realizing that part of that change came from past choices. Not mistakes, not wrong decisions, but the necessary sacrifices to achieve what he achieved. Every pitch in 1988, every game he continued when his body was already tired, every time he ignored pain to hold his spot, they all helped create the man he became, but they also helped create what he was feeling now. And in that awareness, there was a complicated mix of pride and regret. Pride in what he'd done, in the journey he'd walked, in not quitting when things got hard. But there were also moments when he wondered if there could have been another way, if he could have done it without paying this price. And then, like so many other questions in his life, the answer wasn't clear. Because without those sacrifices, he might never have become the person the world knew. So instead of fighting that truth, he began learning to live with it, not by denying it, not by regretting it, but by acceptance. A kind of acceptance that only comes after many years of experience, after going through both the peak and everything that followed. He understood his body was no longer what it used to be, and never would be again. But that didn't diminish the value of what he'd achieved. It only made the story more complete, a story, not just about victory, but about the cost of victory. And perhaps that's what few people see when they remember Orel Hershiser. They remember the perfect pitches, the historic games, the titles etched into the sport's memory. But they don't see the mornings when he needed extra time for his body to adjust, the moments when a simple movement became harder, the quiet reminders that time has passed and what happened can't be undone. But through all of it, one truth remained unchanged: that he had lived fully with his choices, that he hadn't backed down when the opportunity came, that he hadn't held anything back for later, but had given everything to the moments he believed mattered most. And maybe that's what gave the price meaning, not because it was easy, but because it proved what he'd done was real, profound, big enough to leave a mark not just in history, but in his very body. And looking back, in the silence of these later years, Orel Hershiser no longer tried to become the man he once was. He no longer fought time or his body. Instead, he accepted that the body has its own memory, that what happened will always be there, and that sometimes the price of greatness isn't something you pay once, but something you carry for the rest of your life. And looking at the entire journey from the boy who always felt he wasn't enough, to the man standing at the peak of baseball, then through the years of injury, decline, and silence, Orel Hershiser's story isn't that of the most talented, nor of a flawless legend. He wasn't the pitcher with the fastest pitch, wasn't born with qualities that made the world stop from the start. But if there was one thing that set him apart, one thing that makes his story echo long after the numbers ended, it was his capacity to endure. A capacity not loud, not celebrated enough, but the foundation of everything. He had no career defined by scandal, no public collapses, no self-destructive stories for the media to exploit. On the surface, his life might look like a steady curve peak, then decline, then a quieter life. But in that very steadiness, another kind of tragedy exists. The tragedy of what wasn't seen. Because he didn't destroy himself, didn't collapse in front of the world, but he paid the price, bit by bit, through every year, with his own body and mind. Every pitch in 1988, every game he continued when his body started speaking up, every decision not to stop when he should have, they all built the legend the world remembers. But at the same time, they all left traces, not on the stat sheet, but in the lingering pain into his 60s, in the memories his body never forgets, in the silent moments with no audience close enough to understand. And perhaps that's the true price of greatness. Not what you achieve at the top, but what you have to carry when you step down. But what makes Orel Hershiser's story memorable isn't just the price he paid, but how he paid it. He didn't become bitter. He didn't let the pain turn him into someone else. He didn't use his struggles as an excuse to fall apart. Instead, he kept going in silence, in discipline, in acceptance. Not because he felt no pain, but because he learned to live with it. His legacy, therefore, isn't only in the titles, the records, or the historic seasons. It lies in the less mentioned but deeper things. The discipline to keep going when no one was watching, the humility to accept he wasn't perfect, and the endurance to stand firm when everything started to change. Discipline, humility, endurance. These words may sound simple, but in Orel's life they weren't concepts, they were living realities, what he had to build and preserve through every phase. And if there's one message his story leaves, it's not "be the best" or "win at all costs." His message is simpler, but far harder. Greatness isn't about never feeling pain. It's about how long you can endure, how far you can keep going when things get hard, how well you can hold on to yourself when no one's clapping anymore. Because the greatest victory doesn't always happen on the field. Sometimes it happens in the silent moments no one sees. And when the story closes, when all the lights are off, when the memories gradually become history, what's left isn't just what he did, but how he lived. A man not perfect, not invincible, but steadfast. A man not defined by his greatest moments, but by his ability to continue after those moments had passed. Because in the end, what made Orel Hershiser special wasn't that he reached the peak, but that he didn't collapse when he left it. Not that he conquered the world, but that he didn't let the world break him. And in the silence of all that, his story doesn't end as a loud legend, but as a gentle, yet profound reminder that some people don't need to shine brightly to become great, because they did something far harder. They endured. He didn't fall apart in front of the world. He carried the weight quietly for a lifetime. The story of Orel Hershiser leaves a feeling that's both heartbreaking and deeply respectful, because he wasn't an easy winner, but someone who quietly endured throughout his entire journey, from the childhood years always feeling not enough, to being overlooked in college and the minors, then exploding in the legendary 1988 season, where he won the Cy Young, set the 59 consecutive scoreless innings streak. Everything built the image of a hero. But right at that peak, the tragedy also began. His body pushed to the limit. The shoulder injury in 1990, surgery, and from then on living in the shadow of his own past. Details, like having to relearn how to exist instead of dominate, or sleepless nights haunted by every pitch, show the mental price few saw. When his career ended, the feeling of being left behind as baseball moved on. Then the later years with an aching body in his 60s, and beyond all of it, paints a heartbreaking truth. Greatness doesn't disappear, but it leaves lasting marks. Yet what makes him worthy of respect is how he faced it. No scandal, no collapse, no blame, but acceptance, adaptation, and continuing with discipline and humility. For American society, where success is often measured by peaks and spotlight, this story is a profound reminder that true value isn't in how much you achieve, but in how you endure and hold yourself together when the lights go out. It teaches that resilience, personal responsibility, and steadfastness are the foundation of a meaningful life, even when no one's clapping anymore. If the story of Orel Hershiser's quiet endurance makes you think, hit subscribe so we can keep exploring the journeys behind the spotlight that the world never sees. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video where every story isn't just about glory, but about the real price of it.